August 7th, 1944. A dirt road 3 kilometers south of Mortagne, France. Corporal James Bates sat in the gunner's seat of his M4 Sherman tank, watching through his periscope as a German Tiger I emerged from the tree line 800 yards ahead. The Tiger's 88mm gun was already traversing toward his position. Bates had seen Tigers before. Every American tanker in Normandy had heard the stories. Frontal armor 7 inches thick, a gun that could punch through a Sherman's armor at 2,000 yards, mechanical nightmares that broke down constantly but were nearly indestructible when they worked. His tank's standard 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's front plate at any range. But today, Bates wasn't loaded with standard ammunition. Sitting in his ready rack were 5 rounds that looked almost identical to regular armor-piercing shells, except for one detail. Stenciled on each casing in white paint were 4 letters: HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, rounds that American tankers had been told could do the impossible. His tank commander's voice crackled through the intercom. "Gunner, sabot, tank, 800. Bates grabbed one of the HVAP rounds from the rack, loaded it, and centered his sight on the Tiger's glacis plate. Everything he'd been taught about Sherman gunnery said this was suicide. You didn't engage Tigers frontally. You flanked them, hit them from the side, or you died. He fired. The recoil was sharper than normal, the report louder. Through the smoke, Bates watched his tracer arc toward the Tiger, at a velocity that seemed impossible. The round struck the glacis plate 2 feet left of the driver's visor, and punched straight through. The Tiger shuddered, stopped, and began burning from the inside. Bates had just fired a round that represented 3 years of American metallurgical research, desperation-driven innovation, and a quiet technological revolution that German intelligence never fully understood. The Tiger crew who died in that tank had been taught that Sherman 75mm guns were ineffective against their frontal armor. They were right, until they weren't. This is the story of how American engineers solved an impossible ballistics problem and gave outgunned tank crews a weapon that violated everything the enemy believed about armor penetration. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem began in North Africa in February 1943. American tank crews, fresh from training and confident in their equipment, encountered German armor for the first time at Kasserine Pass. The results were catastrophic. German Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns engaged American M4 Shermans at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. American return fire bounced off German frontal armor. German fire punched through Sherman armor with brutal efficiency. The Americans lost 183 tanks in 5 days. Crews abandoned functional vehicles rather than face German guns. After-action reports described American tankers as demoralized, outgunned, and convinced their equipment was inferior. The problem wasn't the Sherman itself. The M4 was mechanically reliable, had excellent crew ergonomics, and possessed superior optics to most German tanks. But its 75mm gun-firing standard M61 armor-piercing rounds couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of Germany's newer tanks. The M61 armor-piercing shot was a solid steel projectile, weighing 15 pounds, leaving the gun barrel at 2,030 feet per second. Against the thin armor of early Panzer IIIs and IVs, it worked adequately. Against the progressively thicker armor appearing on German tanks in 1943, it was increasingly inadequate. Armor penetration depends on 3 factors: projectile mass, velocity, and how that kinetic energy concentrates at the point of impact. Increase any of those factors and penetration improves. But each factor has practical limits. Make the projectile heavier, and you reduce velocity because the gun's propellant charge can only impart so much energy. Increase propellant charge to boost velocity, and you exceed the gun's structural limits, causing catastrophic barrel failures. American ordnance engineers understood these constraints perfectly. They'd been working on improved anti-armor ammunition since 1941, before America even entered the war. The British had shared data from their combat experience in North Africa. The Germans were fielding tanks with frontal armor exceeding 3 inches thick. Standard solid shot couldn't defeat that, not at combat ranges. The solution came from an unexpected source. In 1938, a French weapons designer named Edgar Brandt had developed a concept called the arrow shell, a sub-caliber projectile that was smaller than the gun barrel firing it. The projectile sat in a disposable sleeve called a sabot that filled the barrel and transmitted propellant gas pressure to the projectile. When the round left the barrel, the sabot fell away, and the lightweight projectile continued at extremely high velocity. The physics were elegant. A 75mm gun normally fired a projectile 75mm in diameter. But what if the actual penetrator was only, say, 45mm in diameter? It would be much lighter, so the same propellant charge could accelerate it to far higher velocities. And because all that kinetic energy concentrated on a smaller impact area, penetration increased dramatically. The French had experimented with the concept before their defeat in 1940. The British picked up the research and developed their own version, called Armour-Piercing Discarding Sabot, or APDS. But British production capacity was stretched thin, and APDS rounds remained experimental through most of 1942 and 43. American engineers approached the problem differently. Rather than a full sabot design, they developed what they called composite rigid shot. The penetrator was a tungsten carbide core, an extremely hard metal alloy, surrounded by a light aluminum jacket that filled the gun barrel. The aluminum jacket wasn't designed to separate like a sabot. It stayed attached to the penetrator but was so light it added minimal mass while still allowing efficient propellant energy transfer. Tungsten carbide was the critical innovation. This material, normally used for cutting tools and drill bits, was nearly twice as dense as steel and significantly harder. A tungsten core could punch through armor that would shatter a steel projectile. The challenge was manufacturing. Tungsten carbide is difficult to machine, expensive to produce, and was in critically short supply. The United States needed tungsten for aircraft engine parts, machine tools, armor-piercing machine gun bullets, and dozens of other war applications. Using large quantities of tungsten for tank ammunition seemed wasteful, especially when America was producing thousands of tanks and each tank crew might fire hundreds of rounds during their combat lifetime. But the Ordnance Department made a calculated decision. Tungsten was scarce, but trained tank crews were more scarce. If tungsten ammunition kept crews alive, the investment was worthwhile. Development accelerated through late 1942. The first experimental HVAP rounds were tested in January 1943 at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Engineers fired test rounds at captured German Panzer IV armor plates mounted on test stands. The results exceeded expectations. Standard M61 armor-piercing shot penetrated 3.1 inches of armor at 500 yards. The experimental HVAP round penetrated 4.7 inches at the same range. That difference was revolutionary. 4.7 inches of penetration meant the Sherman's 75mm gun could defeat the frontal armor of every German tank in production except the Tiger I, and could defeat Tiger I's side armor. But production was another matter. The rounds required precision manufacturing. The tungsten core had to be perfectly centered in the aluminum jacket, or the projectile would tumble in flight and lose accuracy. The jacket had to be strong enough to survive the gun's acceleration forces, but light enough not to reduce velocity. Early production batches had failure rates exceeding 30%. Rounds tumbled, jackets separated, tungsten cores shattered. Engineers refined the design through 1943, testing variants with different jacket thicknesses, different tungsten alloy compositions, different propellant charges. By October 1943, they had a production-ready round designated M93 HVAP. The M93 weighed 9 pounds compared to the M61's 15 pounds. Muzzle velocity was 3,400 feet per second compared to 2,030. At 500 yards, the M93 could penetrate up to 5 inches of armor under optimal impact angles. That was enough to defeat Tiger First frontal armor if you hit the right spot, and more than enough to defeat any other German tank frontally. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. First, production capacity was limited by tungsten availability. The War Production Board allocated enough tungsten for approximately 40,000 HVAP rounds per month, starting in January 1944. That sounds substantial until you realize the U.S. Army had over 10,000 Sherman tanks in service by that point, with hundreds more being produced monthly. 40,000 rounds per month meant roughly 4 rounds per tank per month. Tank crews typically carried 60 to 70 rounds of main gun ammunition. Allocating their entire supply to HVAP was impossible. The rounds had to be rationed, reserved for specific tactical situations where they were most needed. Second, the rounds had drawbacks compared to standard ammunition. The tungsten core was smaller diameter, which meant it created a smaller hole when it penetrated. Against lightly armored vehicles, this was actually worse than standard ammunition. A standard 75mm shell created massive spalling and fragmentation inside the target. The HVAP round punched a clean hole, and if it didn't hit something critical, the target might survive. The rounds also had reduced effectiveness against angled armor. Standard armor-piercing shot could defeat armor by shattering it. The HVAP's tungsten core was so hard it didn't deform on impact, but extremely steep angles would cause it to ricochet, and the aluminum jacket provided zero explosive effect. These were pure kinetic penetrators. Third, and most critically for combat crews, the rounds looked nearly identical to standard ammunition, except for the HVAP stenciling. In the chaos of combat, loaders had to identify rounds quickly. Loading the wrong ammunition at the wrong moment could mean the difference between killing an enemy tank and being killed by it. The Army developed strict protocols for HVAP distribution and use. Rounds were issued to tank platoons, not individual tanks. Platoon leaders decided when situations warranted their use. Crews were instructed to load HVAP only when engaging heavy armor at medium to long ranges. Against light vehicles, infantry positions, or buildings, standard, high-explosive or armor-piercing rounds were preferred. Training emphasized ammunition discipline. Every HVAP round had to be accounted for. Crews that expended HVAP ammunition had to justify it in after-action reports. This created psychological pressure. Tankers knew the rounds were valuable and rare. Some crews became reluctant to use them even when appropriate, hoarding them like precious resources. The first HVAP rounds reached combat units in North Africa in November 1943, but only in tiny quantities for field testing. Crews reported that the rounds worked as advertised when they could be used, but tactical situations where they made sense were limited. Most engagements in the North African campaign involved combined arms operations, where tanks fought infantry, anti-tank guns, and light vehicles more often than heavy tanks. The real test came in Italy. American forces landed at Anzio in January 1944 and immediately encountered German Tiger's supporting defensive positions. These Tigers operated from hull-down positions, exposing only their turrets, and engaged American Shermans at ranges exceeding 1,200 yards. Standard 75mm ammunition was ineffective. Tank companies that had received HVAP rounds used them sparingly but effectively. After-action reports from February 1944 describe engagements where Shermans defeated Tigers frontally for the first time. German tank crews, accustomed to near invulnerability against Sherman fire, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Several Tiger crews abandoned functional vehicles after taking HVAP penetrations, not understanding how American guns had suddenly become so effective. German intelligence eventually recovered unexploded HVAP rounds and conducted metallurgical analysis. Their reports, captured after the war, show confusion about American tungsten supplies. German analysts knew tungsten was scarce worldwide. They assumed American HVAP production was limited and that widespread deployment was impossible. They were partially correct. Production was limited, but the Americans were willing to allocate scarce tungsten to ammunition in ways German resource management didn't anticipate. The German response was to increase armor thickness further. New production Tigers received improved frontal armor. The Panther tank, which entered service in large numbers in 1944, had frontal, glacis armor 5 inches thick at a steep angle. Against such targets, even HVAP struggled at long ranges, but at medium ranges, under 600 yards, HVAP gave Sherman crews a fighting chance where previously they'd had none. Normandy changed everything. When American forces landed in France on June 6, 1944, HVAP distribution increased significantly. Combat in the bocage hedgerow country meant short engagement ranges, often under 400 yards. At those distances, HVAP was devastating against all but the heaviest German armor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By July 1944, HVAP allocation to frontline tank units had increased to roughly 8 rounds per tank, up from 4. Company commanders developed standardized tactics. Each 5-tank platoon designated one tank as the killer, loaded exclusively with HVAP and positioned to engage heavy armor, while the other 4 tanks provided suppressive fire with standard ammunition and engaged softer targets. This tactic emerged not from official doctrine but from practical experience. Lieutenant Robert Early, commanding a tank platoon in the 2nd Armored Division, described the evolution in a 1946 interview. First couple weeks in Normandy, we were all trying to use HVAP sparingly, saving it. Then we realized we were dying while hoarding ammunition. Started concentrating it in 1 tank per platoon. That tank became the Tiger killer. When we encountered heavy armor, everyone else suppressed with HE and smoke while the killer got into position for a side shot or waited for the Tiger to expose itself. The psychological effect on German tank crews was significant and unexpected. Tiger and Panther crews had operated with relative impunity against Sherman guns for over a year. Suddenly, in Normandy, they were taking frontal penetrations. German after-action reports from July and August 1944 show a marked increase in caution. Tank commanders who'd previously pressed attacks aggressively now adopted more defensive postures. Captured German tankers interrogated by Allied intelligence expressed confusion about American ammunition. Several specifically mentioned being told that Sherman guns couldn't penetrate Tiger frontal armor, only to witness exactly that happening. One captured Tiger commander from the 1st SS Panzer Division stated in interrogation, "We were assured the American tanks could not harm us from the front." This proved incorrect. We lost 3 Tigers to frontal hits in 2 days near Cayenne. The rounds penetrated completely. We did not understand how this was possible. What he didn't know was that American crews were being extremely selective about when to engage. HVAP's effectiveness depended heavily on range and impact angle. At 800 yards against a perfectly perpendicular impact, HVAP could defeat Tiger frontal armor. At 1200 yards, or against armor angled even 15 degrees from perpendicular, penetration became uncertain. American tank commanders learned to wait for optimal shots. This required discipline that contradicted every instinct to fire immediately when threatened. Sergeant Michael Chen, a Sherman gunner with the 3rd Armored Division, described the tension in a 1978 oral history. You'd see a tiger, and every fibre of your being wanted to shoot, but if the range was too long or the angle was wrong, you were wasting the only ammunition that could save you. So you waited. Watched this monster that could kill you from a mile away, and you waited for it to move into position where you had a chance. Longest seconds of my life, every time. The German army's response to HVAP was hampered by their own resource constraints and tactical doctrine. German tungsten supplies were severely limited by 1944. They'd lost access to Portuguese and Spanish tungsten sources. What little they had went primarily to armor-piercing machine gun ammunition and anti-tank gun rounds. Developing their own tungsten-cored tank ammunition for defensive purposes never became a priority because German tactical doctrine emphasized offensive action. German tanks were designed to attack, not defend. The Tiger and Panther had excellent frontal armor specifically to enable aggressive assaults against defended positions. German commanders expected their tanks to be shooting at American tanks, not being shot at while stationary. HVAP's effectiveness against hull-down or defensive positions didn't fit German operational expectations. But by late 1944, Germany was fighting a defensive war, whether their doctrine acknowledged it or not. Tigers and Panthers increasingly operated from static positions, supporting defensive lines rather than conducting mobile operations. This played directly into HVAP's strengths. A hull-down Tiger was a perfect target for a patient Sherman gunner with HVAP, waiting for the optimal moment. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 provided the clearest demonstration of HVAP's tactical impact. German 5th Panzer Army launched a major counteroffensive against American positions near the French town of Aracourt. The Germans committed over 260 tanks, including significant numbers of Panthers. The American 4th Armored Division defended with approximately 200 Shermans. On paper, the Germans had overwhelming advantages. Panther tanks had better guns, thicker armor, and longer effective engagement ranges than Shermans. But the 4th Armored had three critical factors working in their favor. First, excellent intelligence about German approach routes allowed them to establish defensive positions. Second, experienced crews who understood how to use terrain to negate German range advantages. Third, substantial HVAP allocation, roughly 12 rounds per tank. The battle lasted 5 days, from September 18th to 23rd. German forces lost approximately 140 tanks. American losses were 55 tanks, with many of those recovered and repaired. The kill ratio heavily favored the Americans, despite fighting against technically superior vehicles. After-action analysis of knocked-out German tanks showed that HVAP accounted for roughly 40% of kills against Panthers and Tigers, despite representing less than 15% of ammunition expended. Standard 75mm rounds achieved most kills against lighter Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns, but against heavy armor, HVAP was decisive. German commanders were baffled by the outcome. Captured documents from 5th Panzer Army headquarters include assessments trying to explain the defeat. Several factors were identified: superior American artillery support, effective American use of terrain, poor German reconnaissance. But several reports specifically mention unexpectedly effective American tank gunnery against heavy armor. One report states, American Sherman fire penetrated Panther frontal armor at ranges previously considered safe. Technical assessment of this phenomenon is required. That technical assessment, when it eventually happened, confirmed what German intelligence had already suspected. The Americans were using tungsten ammunition, but German analysts overestimated American tungsten supplies and assumed widespread use. In reality, HVAP remained scarce throughout the war. The Americans were simply concentrating it at decisive points. Production challenges plagued HVAP throughout 1944 and into 45. The tungsten carbide cores required precision manufacturing that pushed American industrial capabilities. Rejection rates for finished rounds remained around 15%, even with improved quality control. Every rejected round represented critical tungsten wasted. The war. Production board continuously balanced competing tungsten demands. Aircraft engine production consumed massive quantities. Cutting tools for industrial machinery, armor-piercing 50 caliber ammunition for aircraft machine guns, anti-tank gun ammunition for towed guns and tank destroyers. Sherman HVAP was one priority among many. By December 1944, monthly HVAP production had increased to 65,000 rounds. This coincided with the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, where American tank units faced the largest concentration of German armor since Normandy. HVAP allocations spiked. Some tank companies received as many as 20 rounds per tank, far above normal distribution levels. The effectiveness was immediate and noticeable. German Tiger IIs, the massive 70-ton behemoths with frontal armor exceeding 7 inches thick, proved vulnerable to HVAP at close ranges. While HVAP couldn't reliably penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at long range, at 300 yards or less, hitting the turret face or lower glacis plate could achieve penetration. American crews learned these specific aim points through hard-won experience. Corporal James Bates, whose engagement opened this story, survived the war and completed 38 missions in his Sherman. In a 1992 interview, he reflected on HVAP's impact. People ask if we felt outgunned against Tigers and Panthers. Honestly, yes. German tanks were better in most technical ways. Thicker armor, bigger guns. But HVAP gave us a chance. You still had to be smart, use terrain, pick your shots, but when everything lined up right, you could kill a Tiger frontally. That knowledge, just knowing it was possible, changed how you fought. You weren't helpless anymore. That psychological transformation was perhaps HVAP's most significant contribution. American tank crews entered combat in 1943, believing they were driving inferior vehicles against superior German armor. This wasn't entirely wrong. The Sherman had numerous disadvantages, but HVAP provided a capability that partially offset those disadvantages. Not completely, not overwhelmingly, but enough to matter. Tank crew morale improved measurably in units receiving regular HVAP allocations. After-action reports from company commanders noted increased willingness to engage heavy German armor rather than avoid or wait for tank destroyer support. Crews took more aggressive positions, knowing they had ammunition capable of defeating threats they'd previously considered unkillable. The Germans never solved the HVAP problem. Late-war German tank development focused on increasing armor thickness and gun size. The Jagdtiger mounted a 128mm gun behind armor 10 inches thick. The Maus Super Heavy tank prototype had armor exceeding 9 inches. These were responses to a threat environment that included increasingly effective Allied anti-tank weapons, including HVAP. But this approach was strategically counterproductive. Heavier armor meant heavier tanks. Heavier tanks consumed more fuel, broke down more frequently, and were harder to transport. Germany's deteriorating logistical situation by 1945 made operating such vehicles nearly impossible. Many were abandoned due to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion rather than combat damage. American doctrine took the opposite approach. Rather than making tanks heavier to survive enemy fire, American industrial capacity focused on producing large numbers of adequate tanks and giving them ammunition that could defeat enemy armor when necessary. The Sherman remained fundamentally unchanged from 1943 to 45, but its effectiveness increased dramatically through improved ammunition, better tactics, and crew experience. HVAP's limitations became more apparent as the war progressed into Germany proper in 1945. Urban combat in German cities created engagement ranges often under 100 yards. At such close ranges, even standard 75mm ammunition could defeat most German armor through side or rear hits. HVAP's advantages diminished. Additionally, German resistance was collapsing. Heavy tank encounters decreased as German armoured forces were destroyed or ran out of fuel. The final months of the war saw HVAP allocation actually decrease, not because supplies were exhausted, but because tactical necessity declined. Tank combat in April and May 1945 primarily involved engaging infantry positions, anti-tank guns, and fortifications. High-explosive ammunition was more useful than armor-piercing of any type. Tanks that had hoarded HVAP rounds through months of combat ended the war with nearly full loads, never having needed them. Post-war analysis by the Army Ordnance Department attempted to quantify HVAP's impact. The conclusions were necessarily imprecise. Battlefield conditions made definitive cause and effect difficult to establish. But the analysis estimated that HVAP increased Sherman effectiveness against heavy German armor by approximately 300%. A Sherman with HVAP was 3 times more likely to destroy a Tiger or Panther in a frontal engagement than the same Sherman with standard ammunition. That figure represented the difference between probable destruction and possible survival for thousands of American tank crews. The exact number can never be known, but every engagement where HVAP enabled a Sherman to kill a Tiger that would have otherwise killed the Sherman represented 5 American lives saved. The technology didn't end in 1945. HVAP principles influenced all subsequent armor-piercing ammunition development. The American 76mm gun that replaced the 75mm on later Sherman variants used HVAP ammunition designated M93. The 90mm gun on the M26 Pershing heavy tank used HVAP designated T30. Even after tungsten supplies improved post-war, the sabot principle remained superior for armor penetration. Modern tank ammunition uses fin-stabilized armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, direct descendants of the HVAP concept. The M829 round, fired by the M1 Abrams, uses a depleted uranium penetrator surrounded by a sabot that separates after leaving the barrel, achieving velocities over 5,000 feet per second. The physics are identical to what American engineers developed in 1942, just refined through decades of metallurgical and ballistic research. The scarcity that characterized HVAP during World War II created lasting impressions on those who used it. Veterans consistently describe the rounds as precious, valuable, something to be carefully preserved and used only when absolutely necessary. This created a strange psychological relationship with ammunition, unlike anything soldiers typically experience. Bullets and shells are normally expendable. You fire them without much thought beyond hitting the target. HVAP demanded calculation, judgment, restraint. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison, a tank commander in the 1st Armored Division, described this relationship in a 1958 memoir. "We treated HVAP like gold. Literally counted the rounds, made sure the loader knew exactly where they were stowed, reported every round expended. I've never been so conscious of individual bullets in my entire military career. Each one represented a chance to survive an encounter that should have killed us. You don't waste chances like that." The German perception of HVAP remained incomplete throughout the war. German intelligence knew the Americans had developed tungsten ammunition. They knew it was effective, but they never fully grasped the scarcity or the tactical protocols governing its use. German assessments tended to assume American tungsten supplies were larger than reality, leading to tactical overcorrection. Some German tank commanders became excessively cautious, avoiding engagements where American tanks might have HVAP. Others dismissed HVAP as rare and continued operating as if Sherman guns remained ineffective. Neither extreme was correct. HVAP was neither unlimited nor negligible. It was a carefully managed resource that appeared at critical moments, concentrated where it would matter most. This created an uncertainty that worked in American favor. German crews never knew if the Sherman they faced had HVAP or not. Every engagement carried risk that hadn't existed before. The psychological advantage of invulnerability, so important to Tiger and Panther crews early in the war, eroded gradually through 1944 and into 45. HVAP was a major contributor to that erosion. The legacy of HVAP extends into modern military procurement and doctrine. The World War II experience demonstrated that modest qualitative improvements to ammunition could offset significant platform disadvantages. This influenced post-war thinking about weapons development. Rather than always pursuing better tanks, artillery, or aircraft, military planners recognized that improving munitions could achieve similar results at lower cost. The concept of the silver bullet, a specialized round held in reserve for critical targets, became standard doctrine. Modern tank crews carry mixed ammunition loads, general-purpose rounds for most targets, and specialized penetrators for heavy armor. This directly traces to World War II HVAP tactics. The idea that not every round needs to defeat every target, that specialized ammunition for specific threats, is more efficient than trying to make every round capable of everything, revolutionized ammunition thinking. For the soldiers who used HVAP, the technology represented something profound beyond its technical specifications. It represented American industrial power reaching across the Atlantic to give them tools that partially offset German engineering advantages. It represented scientists and engineers they'd never meet working to keep them alive. It represented the possibility that being outgunned didn't mean being defeated. Corporal James Bates, reflecting on his wartime experience 50 years later, summarized the feeling many veterans expressed. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of the war. We knew that. German tanks were better in most ways. But we had more of them, better logistics, and when we needed it, ammunition that could kill anything they fielded. HVAP was part of that. It wasn't perfect. It was scarce, it was specialized, and you had to use it right. But it worked. And in combat, something that works is all you need. The Tiger Eye that Bates destroyed south of Mortain in August 1944 was recovered after the war, studied, and eventually cut up for scrap. The penetration through its frontal glacis plate was photographed and measured. The hole was 2.8 inches in diameter, clean edges, penetrated completely through 7 inches of armor. Metallurgical analysis confirmed tungsten residue. The photograph exists in the National Archives, technical documentation of the moment American engineering defeated German steel. That single engagement, one of thousands involving HVAP during the last year of World War II, represented the culmination of a technological race that began in French design studios before the war, accelerated through British desperation, and reached practical implementation through American industrial capacity and tungsten allocation decisions made by bureaucrats in Washington who never saw combat. The men firing those rounds didn't understand the metallurgy. They didn't need to. They understood that when the letters HVAP appeared on a shell casing, that round could save their lives. They understood that German tank crews who'd operated with impunity for years were suddenly vulnerable. They understood that impossible shots were now merely difficult, and difficult shots were achievable with skill and patience. German tank crews laughed at Puny 75mm Shermans until HVAP rounds punched through Tigers. Then they stopped laughing. They started dying, and the Americans who fired those rounds, young men from farms and cities who'd never imagined they'd fight tank duels in French hedgerows, proved that technological superiority was never permanent. That scarcity could be managed, concentrated, and applied at decisive moments. That being outgunned was a temporary condition, not a permanent state. The tungsten cores that made HVAP possible were rare and precious. So were the lives they saved. American military leadership understood this equation and made the calculation that every tungsten round was worth the crew it might save. In total war, that mathematics becomes simple. You allocate resources to keep soldiers alive. Everything else is secondary. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.